when it comes to it, exactly right, sir. When it comes to it, people are going to ask themselves the question: who is actually going to govern this economy sensibly? Who is actually going to cut my taxes? Who is going to stand up against the unions? Who's going to deliver a proper education policy? Who's going to continue with all our levelling up agenda?
Let's break this absolute bollocks down.
Who is actually going to govern this economy sensibly?
Well, the fiscal policies in Liz Truss's mini-budget caused turmoil in financial markets and forced up borrowing costs.
People's bills rising. Everyone poorer.
The price of the weekly shop, if you look at food prices, has gone up by about 16%. And for the poorest families, the things they typically buy have gone up by even more.
Energy bills doubling, inflation at a 40-year high.
The Bank of England's inflation target is 2%, but currently inflation is about 10%.
Inflation running at 10, 11, 12, 13% makes everyone poorer.
More expensive food, fuel.
Many families are having to cut back.
Unemployment going up, businesses failing.
You were Chancellor until a few weeks ago. UK growth is set to be the worst in the G20 besides Russia. Another study says we will go from 18th to 31st out of 38 OECD countries. Members here see their pounds shrinking, probably as fast as they see their high streets closing.
Of course I want to see growth growing, Nick, right? Of course. Now, we have to think about how to do that.
A pound in your pocket is worth less than it used to be.
We have tried a failed experiment.
We see the UK pretty close to the bottom of the league table in terms of the forecast for economic growth, particularly in 2023. So the UK essentially sees no growth at all, and the only country that was worse than the UK was sanctioned Russia.
In fact, the Conservative government has managed to deliver the biggest drop in living standards since records began.
Who is actually going to cut my taxes?
Seriously?
Read my lips, we will not be raising taxes.
You accept that the tax burden is now up?
Yes.
You made millions pay more in income tax by changing the thresholds.
You have dragged very low earners into the 20% tax bracket, and before they didn't pay any tax.
Having made a manifesto pledge not to raise taxes, the Conservative government then hiked them to their highest level in 70 years.
Who is going to stand up against the unions?
Our trade unions represent the working people in this country. Without them, we wouldn't have a minimum wage, maternity and paternity rights, pension provision, holiday and sickness entitlements. Victories which have benefited every single person in this country. And at the very moment, workers across the country are standing together and saying enough is enough to the biggest drop in living standards since records began. Enough is enough to a decade of soaring food banks, poverty and wage stagnation under successive Conservative governments. The Prime Minister is now trying to railroad through a new anti-strike bill which will rob millions of workers of their democratic right to withdraw their labour, force them to work against their will, and allow them to be sacked if they refuse. It's unthinkable, unworkable, and almost certainly illegal.
Who's going to deliver a proper education policy?
Well, let's take a look at the Conservative Party's record on this. In 2021, then Chancellor Rishi Sunak admitted per pupil funding would do no more than return to 2010 levels in real terms by 2024-25. Don't just take my word for it.
Restore per pupil funding to 2010 levels in real terms.
And Tory MPs actually cheered. That's not a cause for celebration, it's a national embarrassment.
It's effectively restoring per pupil funding to 2010 levels. You've got a lost decade, haven't you?
And if that's not bad enough, the Institute for Fiscal Studies estimates school spending per pupil in 2024 will actually be 3% below 2010 levels in real terms. It's absolutely shocking. Under successive Conservative governments, England's schools have suffered the biggest fall in funding since the 1980s. And the gap between private and state school spending has doubled.
Who's going to continue with all our levelling up agenda?
2 million adults in this country can't even afford to eat every day. Paltry wages and a cost of living crisis means the UK's poorest families are getting even poorer. More than 4 million children are living in poverty under this government. More than 4 million. That's a staggering 30% of children, and 75% of children growing up in poverty actually live in a family where at least one person is working. Just think about that. More than 14 million people now live in poverty. That's 1 in 5, and more are being pushed into poverty every single day. It's not surprising given successive Conservative governments have overseen a decade of soaring food banks, poverty, homelessness and wage stagnation. And if all that's not bad enough, Tory seats have been awarded significantly more money per person from the government's £4 billion levelling up fund than areas with similar levels of deprivation. Voters in Conservative seats got almost £20 more per head than those in similarly deprived non-Tory constituencies in the latest round of levelling up funding. Now that's Tory levelling up for you.
It is the Conservatives. It's the Conservatives every single time. The answer is going to turn out to be Conservative. So don't despair, folks. We're going to get forward. We're going to come back from this. Go out there, give Labour the shock they deserve. Thank you.
Never underestimate just how thick they think we all are.